Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to CogX. This is a talk on our education track today, which is on the question of what the pandemic has shown us about the sort of how we could perhaps radicalise education and training. We've got a brilliant speaker today, but I'm going to leave it to Robbie Stamp of Bioss International to introduce him. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you very much indeed. Euan, it's lovely to be here today, the two of us. Just quickly, sort of for establishing sort of the kind of things that we're interested in generally. My interest is deeply in human cognition, sense-making development, and a sort of almost a belief that one of the single most important public goods is thinking about developing people's capability. And that seems deeply relevant for you and the work that you're doing. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about your background and how you came to this, and then we can get into a few questions. And I think we've got about half an hour, and then I think we'll try and take some questions from the audience after that.
Yeah, sounds great. And thanks for opening up with a suitably weighty and meaty question for me to answer. I think, look, there's no doubt that is a massive thing. As we look at the development of AI, machine learning and technology and the impact that is having on what skills you need to be successful in the workforce, who gets access to opportunity, how we distribute those opportunities more evenly, it's all incredibly relevant to the work we're doing. I mean, just to start with on my background. So I began my career in investment banking at Morgan Stanley, armed with a degree in ancient history and a master's in international relations that, while interesting in some ways, taught me absolutely nothing about this job I was supposed to do. And I ended up learning everything about that job on the job. And I was very struck by the fact that I was surrounded in this investment bank by people who were pretty much entirely white, pretty much entirely middle class from pretty privileged backgrounds. They'd all gone to the same small handful of universities, in some cases even the same small handful of schools. And it was a consequence of a system that was relying on an academic set of criteria to go and select who got access to these opportunities. And I was in finance for 5 years. It wasn't what I loved. I was much more interested in education and employment. And so I left to do something really quite different. I joined an organization helping long-term unemployed people find work, with a big focus in the UK and Australia. Started in business development, ended up becoming the CEO of the UK business. And we helped 100,000 people with serious barriers to employment find jobs. And that felt like a victory. The challenge was, when you dug into the data, too often we were getting people temporary jobs in hospitality and retail and charity shops. What we couldn't do was change the direction of their lives. And so the obsession for me became, how do we make sure the best jobs of the next decade, which, by the way, are completely up for grabs because they're being created as we speak, don't just go to the same people as the best jobs of the last decade? And how do we ensure that all these changes that are happening in the world actually allow us to distribute opportunities evenly as talent, rather than end up in a situation like the ones that we've had previously? And so it was that idea that led me to found Multiverse, with this belief that if we could create a genuinely outstanding alternative to university and to your sort of sporadic corporate training, that you would be able to create a much fairer and actually more accurate way of assessing who could go into which jobs and sort of supporting them to be successful over their careers.
There's a lot there, and so a lot there to unpack. And also welcome to anybody who's there to join us on Hop-In. And if you've got questions, please send them in, and we will try and make sure that we take some online, because I know it's nice to say hi to people out there in virtual land as well. I'm going to reframe it as well in terms of thinking about that fundamental challenge that AI creates as it makes inroads into the physical lever work that we do, but also clearly cognitively as well, what things that we've been able to do. So you used a phrase just then about the best new jobs are yet to be created. So two-part question, always dangerous, but one is, what are those? And two, where do you sit on the, it's all going to be all right, we don't know where the new jobs are going to be, it'll all be all right on the night, as opposed to, it won't. There's some really difficult things coming down the road in terms of the number of new jobs that are actually going to be created in the next 20 to 30 years. So what do you see as the best ones, and where do you sit on that?
I'm ultimately an optimist when it comes to displacement, and actually the changes we see in the labour market, I think, will end up creating more interesting jobs and more access to jobs than we have at the moment. That's my belief. There's a lot of speculation around what these jobs might look like. I mean, it was Satya Nadella, I think, who said come 2030, 80% of the jobs people are doing don't even exist today. Lots of them will be in data analytics, lots of them will be in software engineering, lots of them will be in business operations. They will require human skills as well as technical skills, possibly even more so. I think the key thing is, though, and sort of rather than speculating too much about what those jobs might look like, it's thinking, well, how do we ensure that the way in which we qualify people for those jobs and determine who gets access to those jobs is not simply a consequence of a very binary education system that is rooted in academia and academic accomplishment and doesn't follow the same track it does now. And when I think about this, if you look at what's happened over the last 12 months, you've not just had the impact of the pandemic, you've had Black Lives Matter, you've had a change in the way that governments want to address these issues, and governments are kind of engaging in parts of society they hadn't been engaging in previously. And all of these topics are up for discussion. The fascinating thing we found is every major CEO of every company feels a responsibility to at least show that they are taking equity and inclusion seriously when they think about their future plans. Now, we can be cynical about that and say that's partly because they have to, because they're getting pressure from customers and investors in a way that they never, and the media in a way they never were before. But also, a lot of them realize first that diverse companies are more successful. So we've got to make sure that we are figuring out how to build in more diversity into the system of employment. And secondly, they really do need to represent their customers and emerging customers who look quite different from what their customers looked like before. And so new jobs will accommodate elements of that. And I've been massively heartened by the response from companies to apprenticeships and the things we're talking about, because I think almost the battle's been won now that this is important and this needs to be a priority for every single major board. And I don't think there's been a time in human history like this where there is this much focus from the corporate world and from businesses that had often stayed out of politics and social issues in actually addressing them.
It's interesting. So from thinking about ESG agendas and things, you think this time it really is here to stay, and the importance of that inclusion and diversity. What are I
will just say on that, sorry, Robbie, it's not even an ESG agenda, and this is the good thing. It's not now something that sort of sits in an office for this is someone's responsibility around diversity and inclusion. It's actually now CEO level, board level, we need to be doing something about this because it makes commercial sense as well as it being the morally right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that the hope sort of is that it doesn't go the way of corporate social responsibility, which was kind of sort of making the brochure look good, and actually genuinely is now embedded. And it creates some, I think, very interesting challenges for boards in terms of the way in which they deal with that diversity and how they actually genuinely enable it. So I'd like to ask you the how. Yeah. Where and how do you start? You've talked about the alternative universities.
Yes.
Where do you start to build and do that work? Because it clearly hasn't been happening before, and it needs to happen now. How do you actually genuinely set about doing that?
So to answer that, I'll share a bit about what we're doing. So at Multiverse, there's really a focus on three things. The first is what we call admissions, which is a combination of recruitment and also identifying people's propensity for learning. And it is fair, it's equitable, it's accessible. The bar is very high to be a Multiverse apprentice, but of apprentices on program, 55% are from minority ethnic backgrounds, 40% come from the areas of high socioeconomic deprivation, 57%, including in tech roles, are women. So it's a much better, more diverse spread of people as a pipeline of talent coming into businesses through apprenticeships. So that helps. The second is applied learning, which is basically helping people learn and embed skills through solving problems in the workplace. So you're not cleaving off your education and your training and your work. You're actually bringing the two of them together. Lots of people learn far better in that sort of environment. It actually makes a lot of sense for challenges that exist in the workplace and what managers need people to be able to do. So that helps. And it spans both bringing in entry-level talent and training them, but also actually reskilling people already in the workforce, because you need to approach the two things in tandem if you're going to address these issues. You need to get a more diverse pipeline of talent that isn't just based on someone's academic accomplishments or what university they went to, and you need to reskill and retrain people in particularly jobs that are dying or diminishing into new jobs. And then the final thing is community, because one of the biggest barriers that we find a lot of our potential apprentices have faced in their lives is a lack of social capital. So we've put a lot of focus on community, meetups, socials, sports team societies, but also networking, access to things like how to have a challenging conversation, how to network effectively, how to plan out your career, because these are things that kids from certain backgrounds are given by their parents or certain schools they go to, and everyone else just misses out. And it still frustrates me that in the formal education system, we're not doing enough on teaching things that aren't kind of basic school subjects, but are actually really useful and important life skills that matter to how people can be successful.
What's surprised you most as you've gone in and done this work? Is there anything you didn't expect to find that you have found?
I think that there's a few things. One of the interesting things is it's amazing how often companies want to do something with the right set of intentions and then inadvertently get it wrong. We were working with a big multinational company who said, we've moved away from a lot of traditional assessments, and instead we're going to do values-based assessments to determine who comes in. And we sent them a lot of apprentices to assess. And we noticed that the kind of diversity of people who were getting accepted was a complete outlier in terms of a negative. You have more private school kids, more traditional students from kind of traditional backgrounds. And so we looked at that, and in their tests that they were asking, one of their values questions, as an example, was you're running 10 minutes late for a meeting, and you see a woman who's dropped her shopping bags and she needs some help. Do you stop to help her, or do you run onto the meeting so you're not late? And invariably, basically, people who had a lot of people from backgrounds where this job was the only thing that they really wanted to do, and they were terrified they were going to be fired if they stopped and were late for their job and didn't think this would be an acceptable excuse. We're not stopping. And that was screening them out of the process. So it was just an example of how the unintended consequences of how you phrase questions until you sort of unpack why people are approaching problems in a certain way is really important.
When it's difficult for people going through these processes, what's difficult? What are the particular challenges and issues around peer groups from maybe who aren't part of a program like this, and what that starts to create in terms of the communities that some people come from? What are the particular kind of challenges that you've seen that people face as they move through these kinds of spaces?
It massively varies. And a lot of it relies on community engagement with people from those communities. So I remember one of our Muslim apprentices who joined Facebook and was very successful there, spent a lot of time actually going out to community centres and mosques and addressing in particular Muslim mothers, because she knew from her own experience that they were desperate for her and her peers to go to university and go and get a university education, regardless of which university it was or anything else. That was the objective in and of itself. And so she spent a lot of time addressing this specific issue and saying, let's look at the outcomes. And actually, if I've got a chance here to shortcut that, get something that I'm really excited about and a job that a lot of graduates would be desperate to compete for, then focus on what it is I'm able to do rather than the process. And you find a lot of that in various communities. There's an obsession with academic education, and there's also just a lack of, we've still not done a good enough job as a country at promoting the alternatives to traditional education. It's great the government talks about it so much. It's getting more investment, more attention. A lot of the work we've done has helped get it some attention as well. But the fact is, you can today go and work at some of the world's best companies without a degree, and you can be successful there. And that message has not yet percolated out widely enough.
Do you think that the entire university experience is going, I mean, the effect of the pandemic, the costs of it, what do you see emerging in 10, 15 years, even for the elite universities? And how much change do you think is coming to the university sector as a whole?
I mean, I think it is facing a tidal wave of change. It's been so interesting that when you look at this kind of university light experience a lot of students have been faced with through the pandemic, where they can't do particularly the social things, that the reason a lot of people want to go to university in the first place, that's caused them to pause. Harvard is projected to lose $750 million this year, and particularly in the US, which is a country where 75% of the population go to some form of college. they're expecting to see enrollments drop dramatically. So I think that's part of it, especially when the expense hasn't changed. And it astonished me that so many universities said, we're still going to charge you all the same fees for learning, for room, board, various other things, even though we know we can't offer the experience that you might have expected. And I think to an extent, and look, I'm not anti-university. It absolutely has a place and it's important. It can benefit a lot of people. It just cannot be the only show in town or even the predominant one. And that's, I think what this has done is it's allowed people to make more clear-headed choices about what they are going into academic education for. And there's, you have vice chancellors up and down the country and globally who are having that discussion. Is our purpose to educate people? Is it to give them something that they will enjoy but might not be useful to them in the outside world? Is it to prepare them for work? Is it to get them great jobs? And those discussions are all live, and hopefully you'll find universities that end up specializing more tightly in certain things, because part of the problem has been over the last 20, 30 years, universities have sort of have ended up offering everything to every possible student in a clamour to try and attract more and more people to come. And I'm not sure it's been for the benefit of those students.
Give me a nice sense of a sort of what a day might be, as you're working people, you're taking them through some of the experiences. Just what's happening? What are they doing? What's happening for them in a what's happening on a Monday morning?
It varies massively. They'll get to work one-on-one with a coach, and they'll typically have some form of interaction with a coach once, at least every 2 weeks, sometimes more frequently, and a formal session once a month. They'll be doing their work normally in the workplace, and typically they'll spend about 20% of their time on kind of apprenticeship related activities. And that might, what we spent a lot of time on is making sure that those activities are directly relevant to the things they're going to need to do over the next year. So those goals and objectives are set in conjunction with line managers, in conjunction with people in the organization. So it's fulfilling both their personal desires, but also actually it's useful to the company who are funding it. And this is the important thing. The companies are paying for this. And that's a good thing, because there's no financial friction for people who want to go and pursue this. They're not having to take on debt. They're not having to spend money. So they'll spend time with their coach. They'll do their normal working activities. They'll then potentially go to a community event in the evening. In fact, just last month, we offered office hours in conjunction with a number of Harvard Business School professors who are really keen to support this for apprentices in our community. We've had Rory Sutherland, June Sarpong, Alistair Campbell and others give talks and speeches to people. They can drop in on sessions on how to manage your personal finances. Again, something that staggers me we don't talk about in school, through to how to be a successful data analyst.
Are there any things that you started doing when you set off that you've stopped doing, that you thought, well, that didn't work, or that really didn't work the way that we hoped, so we don't do that anymore?
It's a really good question. There will be lots of things like that. I'm trying to think of some that will be useful for the audience. We used to spend a lot of time, particularly at the start when you're trying to build credibility with companies and you don't have a track record to point to, saying, we'll get someone in, just one apprentice, and you'll like them, and then we can build a program out for there. We're now much clearer that you are better off bringing in a group of apprentices at once into any company, because they've got people they can identify with. It's much easier for them to start to build relationships. They're less isolated. And also, there's a responsibility on the part of businesses engaging with this, that they take it as a serious part of their future talent strategy and talent development. And if it is simply we'll take on an apprentice because it's a nice thing for us to do, the program's rarely ever successful. And we look at, crucially, do people stay with their employer long term? 88% of our apprentices stay long term with their employer after finishing their apprenticeship. That is absolutely crucial.
And what are the things the things that you've been most proud of? Just some individual stories, some that, without necessarily naming names, but obviously, but people, and some stories to really root it in a bit of storytelling and some people, either an individual or a couple of individuals or a cohort.
I'll mention one. I'm sure she won't mind me naming her, Annie Lawrence, who was a digital marketing apprentice at Facebook, and she, in school, was told that she would never amount to anything if she didn't go to any university that would take her. and she was put under a lot of pressure by her teachers to go to university, and she decided not to do that. She went to do an apprenticeship. She got it at Facebook, obviously one of the world's biggest companies, brilliant place to work, everything else doing digital marketing. She was always interested in software engineering and had taught herself to code in the background as well, impressed some of the people there. She got flown out to California, met some of the senior team, spent 3 months in Palo Alto, came back and was then immediately promoted and spent time working on a software engineering project that she ended up transitioning from digital marketing into that role. She's been promoted a couple of times. She's been used in their promotional materials. They talk a lot about that experience. And she was one of 2. They now have, they had 10 apprentices join last year. They'll take more on this year. And actually every junior software engineer they're looking to hire could now be an apprentice in the UK, which is just brilliant. And so she was that early pioneer, but from a situation where her school, and it's hard to place too much blame on schools. They're not given much information about these things, but to focus so much on this obsession with the university to the detriment of the people you're supposed to be helping is frustrating.
I was thinking with a colleague a little while ago, imagining sort of the entire reform of an education system, and thought that one qualitative goal would be that every single child leaves university leaves school with their curiosity intact.
Right.
And how is it that we create how many incurious children, young children as one ever known, and how is it that gradually that curiosity gets ground out, and also that desire to achieve and think? You know, I sometimes listen to adults who talk about they're being interviewed about their at some stage, and they go, "Oh yeah, I must have been awful at school. I was the SWAT. I was the kid who wanted all the work." And you think, you're doing that sort of brag now, but actually, what did it feel like? What are you saying to all the kids who are feeling that way now, right now in school? You're being told by the adults being that you're reinforcing that. It might still come from a place of pain of being that, but there's something profound about how we create conditions in which that curiosity stays alive as a fundamental challenge.
You're absolutely right. And the thing is, employers want people who are curious and asking questions about how they do their jobs better and thinking about that. I think we touched on it before. It comes back to what is the purpose of education and the things that we're teaching people in school. And it is a problem when there is an obsession with exams and an academic track that exists in isolation from what is happening in the real world. We have not got the balance right. And there is no doubt you should have good basic skills in English and maths. It should be every school's responsibility to teach that. And people should be able to explore subjects they want to explore and get into that. But there needs to be a focus as well on what do you need to be successful in the workplace? And curiosity is part of that. So we shouldn't be grinding it out of people. We can do a lot on that on apprenticeships. And it's why, as well, we talk a lot about creating T-shaped individuals. You can have a vertical of specialism. You might be really good data analyst, really good project manager, whatever else, but you need a breadth of knowledge and skills that you can also apply, because the best people are able to do those things. So we try and use our community in particular to give people access to that broader range of skills and things they want to dig into and get really curious about.
Yes, I mean, I think that to come back a little bit at the challenges that AI creates cognitively. I mean, if you think about a situation, maybe now you employ as a company 100 actuaries. In the future, you may employ, I sort of use an image of shepherds and sheepdogs. So you may employ some super duper human shepherd data scientists working with some really sophisticated AI sheepdogs and a lot of relatively dumb AI sheep. But of those 100, you're probably only now employing 10. So it seems to me that the thinking around curiosity and critical thinking, first principles thinking, ways of thinking, which AI still cognitively is nowhere close to, for all of the claims that are made about it, seems to me to be really, really critical. So how much do you do on that ways of thinking, that ways of framing things, different perspectives you can bring to problems, that literally that ways of thinking?
No doubt. And diversity of thought is a big focus of this as well. Again, it comes back to the inherent importance of diversity and having different perspectives. And there are lots of problems around how AI is being built and who's building them and whether it reflects that accurately. Human skills, we haven't even talked about things like emotional intelligence and various decision making that we rely on humans to do. We teach design thinking in several of our apprenticeships. We're actually going to embed that more broadly across the piece, because how people think is really important. You've got to address that. And I think it comes back to that challenge again of education and employment existing in some form of isolation. And the more we can do to bring those things together, we're not only going to end up with better employment outcomes, people leaving school, more evenly distributed opportunities and other things where we can do that. But we'll end up probably with a better sense of what stuff is really necessary that we're teaching people, and where can they be left to figure out what they enjoy and get on with it.
I often think when one thinks about diversity, I mean, in lots of contexts, I mean, sort of both abroad and sort of, one of the things about diversity is it should bring with it challenge and dissonance. Because if it's not, then it isn't diverse.
Right.
And I think people very often talk in organizations about culture fit. And culture fit is great, but it's got a dark side. Because it just means if all you're doing is hiring people like you, and after 6 months, all the edges have been rubbed off and there isn't any challenge. And so it seems to me one of the challenges is how you hold the space for diversity to be diverse,
right,
and not gradually rub those edges off. And that seems to me to be a really interesting challenge across the piece for organizations, but particularly in the area you're working, because it should bring dissonance and challenge with it.
It's such an important point, and it has to. And if you look at the diversity pieces, is the different backgrounds, and be they race, gender, religion, whatever else it might be, sexuality of people in an organization. And then it really comes down to inclusion. And inclusion is, can people be their authentic selves? Can they express that dissonance in a way that is still productive? It's still helpful to the company. In fact, it's actively helpful to the company, but or the organization. But it's encouraged and it's supported. And culture fit is a dangerous thing. We try and talk a lot more about values fit, because I think that's important. You don't want a monocultural organization, but you do want everyone to share the same values. And it's okay to have high standards and strict values that you want people to adhere to. You just, they can't only be values that are relevant to a straight white man who's been privately educated, as an example, because otherwise they're pretty meaningless. And
sort of to work in a question that somebody from the audience has asked about that appreciation of that future capability, how do you do that? And do you do any help for preparing for that evaluation? Is there kind of like any pre-prep to give people the best chances? So how does that whole because you said you kind of need to be, so how does that process work? How does that evaluation who comes on to the program work, and how much support do you give to people to come on?
So it's a process that happens. It's led by our admissions team. We've built a platform to do it, but actually there's a huge amount of human engagement in it, because we're not yet at the stage where we think it's safe to outsource too many of these decisions to machines. We focus a lot on intent. So really, is someone thought seriously about the fact they want to do this? Are they highly motivated? Have they accessed some of the free resources we often point them in the direction of, that they can go and do? If they want to be a software engineer, as an example, have they done some of the 3 coding boot camps that we've shared with them? Have they actually played around with programming at home or in school or anywhere else? We spend a lot of time as well looking at whether or not someone is making a clear-headed decision about what they want to do, as opposed to sort of being bounced into it through pressures by other people. The bar is really high to be a multiverse apprentice. As I said before, there is a strict admissions process. Intent is the most important things. Then we look at things like character, particularly grit and resilience. We look at coachability, because to be successful on an apprenticeship, you need to want to be coached and want to improve. You can't be too defensive. You have to have that growth mindset. And we tease those things out both through a combination of self-assessment and our team assessing and determining that. And then we spend a lot of time preparing people for the interview process, because ultimately everyone's still got to be interviewed by the company who's going to employ them. And some of those can be inscrutable to people who haven't got a certain leg up. I mean, I remember really well in my investment banking interview, I was lucky enough, I was able to speak to people who'd worked in an investment bank. I knew friends of my family and others who did that, and they had an idea of what it did and what you ought to say. That is impossible for someone who doesn't have those connections. So we try and give them cheat sheets on it. And here's the things that some other kids might know that you wouldn't know. And it's really, really important.
Do you come across, I mean, I'm involved in advising. In fact, this little G here, it's a charity in New York, which is about working with. In fact, this was with boys from very tough areas in New York, Brooklyn, gang-infested areas, really tough part of the world. And I'm talking to the founder of that about how he had to deal with some of the anger that is there in some people who felt excluded, and indeed, if they'd had their capability had maybe gone down some slightly dangerous, more difficult paths, and it was being expressed maybe not as positively as it might be. And he was talking about some of those really nitty-gritty challenges about people from these very different backgrounds. He said you wouldn't believe how different the background is, the language, the structures, the way in which, social justice is meted out, a whole range of issues. How much are you at that sharp end of that as well?
A reasonable amount. So we spend a lot of time engaging with communities, talking to people, community leaders, figuring out how you can do that, outreach with charitable organizations and others. The thing that we're always trying to balance is, and often this comes out through a combination of self-assessment and conversations, are people at a stage in their life where they can begin to turn that into a positive and represent it well in an interview and everything else? Because, and this is part of the challenge we have, we cannot help everyone. We're trying to focus right now on how we find people who, mainly through dint of their background, lack of an opportunity, will not get access to a great job or a great career, but could be future leaders because they're ready to go and deal with some of that. And with a bit of coaching and support, we can help them. There are some people where they need a lot more intensive support than we can provide to do that. And realistically, when I think about this at the moment, I'd love, in a few years' time, every major company has ditched their graduate scheme and they have an early career scheme. And some people have gone to university, some people have gone through an apprenticeship, and it is accessible to anyone with the talent to go and do that. And you don't have to have a certain credential from a red brick university. But to do that, we need lots of really great, credible apprentices who are following a positive experience. It's interesting. I remember you talked about learning, having an employer say to me once quite early on, we thought this person was great, but they didn't have enough of a story. We thought maybe they'd have left a gang or something else. And, it was a young black kid from a state school, and he was being judged because his story wasn't sort of
gritty enough.
Yeah, like Hollywood enough.
Right.
And it's ridiculous. So we just have to be careful with that one, because basically we want them to judge people on the merits of what they can bring into the workplace. And some of those experiences can form them to be really successful, and they can use those and leverage those. And we've met plenty of people like that, but I'm always wary of an obsession with the story.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you've seen that, I can understand that. Yes, that's a terrible thing actually to say. Oh, we want one, but that's not.
They said it with the best
gritty enough for us.
Intentions. It was a really, I think, and the good thing is as well, the world has moved on a little bit, even over the past, in fact, a lot over the past year, 18 months. They probably wouldn't say that now, but it was revealing because they might still think it.
Yeah. Something else from the audience, just to sort of to wrap in this issue around unconscious bias, obviously playing a great part. So what do you do about this and sort of trying to avoid that tick box perspective? I mean, how do you work with that? Obviously with the employers and the companies, and so what work do you put in that space?
You focus a lot on getting people to look at facts in interviews. What are the facts? And look at, mentioned before, character intelligence, because companies do still want to employ people with intelligence, just not academic intelligence, coachability, track record of things they might have done that will express they can be successful for this, that might not be the normal things that you would think of. And so most employers and managers will spend a bit of time talking to us about how they should run their interview process, what they might want to modify. We do unconscious bias training as well, but where we are careful is we tell them still, you have an admissions bar for a reason and you want to find great people. So you've still got to keep that bar high. Just tell us as much as possible about the interview process so we know it and we can really understand it, and therefore prepare people for it. So that they're going in with their eyes open and they're not daunted by not having an idea of what to expect.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of creating, again, I'm always so interested in this the context from which people are coming. How much work are you doing with parents and so on who might think that the only, again, it's a question, the only route might be top university, parental pressure, and when it gets difficult for a child who is facing those competing pressures? How much support can you give there? Are you working with parents, with older brothers, with sisters, with grandparents, who, maybe feel, no, this is it. This is the route. So how wide do you need to move in that? You've talked a lot about working with the communities.
Yeah.
How does that actually look like? What does it mean in people's homes, in chats? What does it look like?
We have open days for parents, and we try and the easiest way to reach a broad mass of parents is actually through the media. We had one of our apprentices write a brilliant piece in the Times that was basically, I think the title was, how do we get apprenticeships to pass the middle class dinner party test? Where they basically said, you've got a group of parents sat at a table and they say, my kid's going to Oxford, my kid's going to wherever else. And then someone says, my kid's doing an apprenticeship. And they all sort of kind of go, what went wrong there? Oh God, what was the story? And it's sad that still happens. Happening a lot less now. This was 2019, the piece was written. And so you've got to educate people about what those employment opportunities look like. So what the long-term success is, the kind of companies we're talking about, the people we work with, Google, Facebook, Salesforce, WPP, Clifford Chance, Morgan Stanley, these are Citigroup, these are places that graduates are competing for at top universities. So that absolutely helps with parents. And the other thing is, I realized when this was starting to land, because I was inundated with, let's call them kind of classic pushy parents messaging me on LinkedIn asking if their son or daughter could get a place on one of our programs. And I thought, this is great, because that's exactly what we need. We need them desperately figuring out to see how they can influence the system in their favor. Now, of course, not much we can do to help with that, and we're very deliberately set up not to do that, but it's a great sign that these things are becoming aspirational. People are competing for them, and we've had people turn down places at top universities to go and do this. And don't forget, a large amount of what we do is also reskilling. So we're having people from these great companies who are already in employment go and do this just because of the benefits of the training, and just because they see the power of applied learning and community and everything else.
I don't want to end on a negative note, because actually our TV timing is being turned off as well. So I'm going to keep the timing in my head here. But I think we've got about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll open up some questions.
Yeah, we should do some questions.
But just what worries you most? What do you see as the biggest barriers, where the hardest yards are yet to go to really bring about this kind of change, that the path that you're on?
The thing that probably worries me most, you touched on it before, is if we can't move companies, and we've managed to do this, but there are still some residual pockets, from looking at this as a nice thing to do that makes them feel good and they want to talk about, to actually, this is the core plank of our talent future planning strategy. This is how we're going to identify future leaders. These will be people who will one day be in our boardrooms making decisions. Because that's really what this is all about. When I go back to my experience of working with long-term unemployed people and some of the interventions we could do, the frustration was that we weren't actually able to just change the trajectory of their lives in a really significant way that could be long-lasting. And it's always the fear that if there are people who could go and be the next CEO of a FTSE 100 company, but won't ever get to realize that because they don't have the platform on which to do it or the support on which to do it. That is the thing that sort of would frustrate me. That's what we want to change.
Terrific. Well, let's. I've got one observation, but I'll try and make that at the end. Let's go. If anybody in the audience has got suggested, we're going to run out of time. Or we're out of time already. I thought we had 30 minutes of questions and then 10 minutes of question time.
I'm going to blame Robbie for that.
Blame me entirely. I deeply apologize. While I trying to take questions from the audience, I messed up my timing. I apologize to everybody out there as well. I apologize if we're out of time. Thank you very much, Euan. Terrific stuff.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.